Welcome to Great British Ghosts. Later on I'll be finding out about the infamous Pendle Hill Witches in Lancashire. But first I've come to neighbouring Cheshire to a rather wet day here in Congleton to visit the Lion and Swan Hotel, which is known for its ghosts of a naked wench and a saucy lady of the night.
Built in the 16th century, this half-timbered coaching inn is at the heart of the historic market town of Congleton in Cheshire. It's thought that there was an earlier building on the site, which could date as far back as 1496, which also functioned as a licensed inn. Then, during the early 19th century, the Lion and Swan became the penultimate stop in the new London to Manchester stagecoach service. It has a number of famous ghosts and even a haunted fireplace. The current manager, Billy Roberts, agreed to show me around.
OK, so first, Michaela, I'll take you to the fireplace. This is in the lounge area of the hotel.
Fabulous looking fireplace.
It's a beautiful fire.
It's very detailed, isn't it?
The fire's original to the building. However, the surround is actually an old headboard from a bed. It's filled with pagan fertility symbols.
Oh, is that why they've all got
that's
big
why, and actually
bellies?
touching them is believed to help you conceive.
Oh, just wipe my hand then.
The first sort of story we have is that there was a young girl who has been seen here once or twice.
So a ghost, you mean?
A ghost, yes. She's completely naked, apart from some clogs. And she's believed to have tried to come here to help her conceive, to touch the fireplace. And she's taken a fertility potion, which obviously didn't help, and she died from that. The most prolific ghost sighting we have in the hotel is actually of a coach driver who's been seen many a time stoking the fire in a old brown coat and a brown hat. He's been seen by the owner, he's been seen by the owner's grandchild, who was only 4 or 5 years old, and I actually saw him myself the other day, just 4 or 5 days ago.
The biggest experience that stands out in my mind is with my little boy. We were in the bar area near the haunted fireplace, and he was actually 3 at the time, and he was hiding behind the reception area just to the corner. I was sat on the sofa next to it, and I sort of said to him, "Kian, come and sit down, what are you doing?" And he was sort of looking with a curious sort of little look, as children do. And he said, "I'm watching the man." There was only me and him down at that time in the morning. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. And there was no one there. And he was like, "Mum, I'm watching the man. He's wafting the fire. I can see him at the fireplace." I was like, "What man?" He's like, "The man in the brown coat, Mummy." There was nobody there at the time. So that's the biggest experience to my mind.
Billy, how much of the building is still original?
Well, the building itself is 500 years old. It's been built on many a time throughout the years, however. The fireplace I showed you, room 20 itself, is very much an original room. It's actually the home of our most famous ghost, and it's...
We can see it's still got all the old timber beams.
Yes, it's still single pane glass, still very much original how it would have been. And like I said, it's the home of the most famous ghost that we have, which is the Lady of the Night. Now, she's been known to visit single travelling males. She breathes on the neck in the middle of the night. She also has been felt on top of people, actually, the weight of her on top of people. And a couple of years ago, we had an engineer staying with us who actually at 3 or 4 in the morning came running out of his room screaming, "I didn't touch her, I didn't touch her."
So you don't know if he saw an apparition or what happened?
We don't know what he saw. All we know is he was very scared that night and has decided that he no longer wants to stay with us, and he was spooked.
And this being an old coaching inn, you could have had prostitutes.
There was probably, very much definitely, that sort of thing going on. We also do a lot of seances in the room, and that's when the Lady of the Night came up. But we get residual energy from the seances, and the lights over in the corner, they've actually been known to spark almost a foot away from the light.
So a spark coming
after a séance, yeah.
Out of here?
So it only happens after the séance.
But that's not possible, is it?
It shouldn't be, no. And we've had to sort of calm the room down and seal it so that no one can use it for safety purposes and have the lights checked. And once they've come back, there's been no real problem with the light. It's just one of those things. The paranormal people say it's residual energy.
So you either get electrocuted or squashed to death?
Or you get the flying tables over here.
That's a dangerous room, then.
Or over here, we do quite a lot of investigations, lots of glasswork, which is like the Ouija boards and seances and things. And very recently, we've had the table actually lift off the floor. It very much spooked the people that were here.
Well, that's quite hefty.
It's a heavy table.
So how do you explain that?
Again, it's one of those things you can't explain. Very much like what happens in most of the hotel. I shall show you the corridor, in fact, where we get quite a lot more activity.
This is an active room, though.
It's a very active room.
Local businesswoman Emma Cox has actually stayed in room 20 and says she immediately felt uneasy when she walked in.
When I first came into the room, I did sort of feel like there was somebody else in the room, but I didn't really acknowledge that until later on in the evening. I sort of remembered when I was speaking to the bar staff downstairs that I'd come into the room, put my bag down on the floor and said, "I'll be back in a minute," which is quite out of character for me. I'm usually quite a sort of a lonely person, into my room, put my bag down, go down for a drink. But the fact that I'd sort of said and spoken to the room, I sort of already felt a presence within the room, if that makes sense, but I hadn't acknowledged it. So, and it was just quite cold compared to the rest of the pub.
A lot of people say they hear noises in this room. What do you think those noises are, then?
Yeah, I did hear some noises when I stayed in the room. I kept drifting off to sleep and then I'd be woken up by something, so I'd get out of my bed, turn the lights on thinking, oh, there's something in the room. Have a look round and sort of try and establish where the noise was coming from. And the majority of the time I found that it was just a sign outside of the bedroom window. So you look outside the bedroom window and there's a sign that's sort of blowing in the wind, making a creaking noise. So I don't really feel like it's anything at all, apart from just the building's old. You know, there's like general little creaky noises and the fact that the sign does sort of wake you up with the noise sometimes.
Let me quickly show you room 23. There's a very weird occurrence happened just recently. Yeah, the telephone in reception actually went off. These phones ring down to reception, and as I was sat there, the phone came off, and room 23 was calling, so I answered. Nothing for a while, and then it put the phone down on me. As I was sort of wondering if anyone was actually in room 23, it then decided to make an outside phone call. We later found out there was nothing in room 23. There was no guests, nothing, no one staying. Just decided to pick the phone up and talk to me.
That's really spooky.
It did spook me out quite a lot.
And there's no sort of technical thing that could have
There's
made
no
that
technical
happen.
thing. We've had the phone checked. I came up myself to make sure that no one was actually in the room as an error, and nothing. It was just decided that it wanted to reach out and touch someone.
Sometimes I feel fine, and other times it's quite uneasy feeling. It depends, it changes from time to time. Like the last Monday, I had to stay over to do a night duty and I couldn't sleep at all. I was absolutely terrified.
Let me show you something else that happened very recently. In fact, just a couple of months ago, I was closing the hotel, and I actually live in this apartment here. And as I came, I'd closed the hotel maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and as I came up the corridor, I got to around this area and I heard a very definite giggle. It was sort of like a high-pitched girl, and I couldn't sort of work out where the giggling was coming from, but it was 2 nights on the trot as well, and it sort of it was a young girl's high-pitched giggle. It was definite.
How did that make you feel? Did it freak you out?
It freaked me out quite a lot. I was actually, like I said, I just lived there, so it was too near to my apartment for me to like, but I just sort of very quickly got in the door and sort of locked the door, and that was me for the night.
Has anyone else experienced it?
The owner's, he has a dog, and he walked the dog up the corridor. This was maybe 6 months back, and he heard the crashing of his own grandchildren charging up behind him, and as he turned round to welcome them, there was nothing there. There was no no grandchildren, nothing, but it sounded like there was children behind him. And the dog had actually bolted at that time, refused to come back in.
Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because they say that dogs see spirits much more than we do.
It's true, and there's meant to be a sort of... there's reportings of a girl or a boy, a young girl or boy, that roams this corridor up and down here.
What did your dad think to that experience?
He thought it was strange, yeah, he was quite spooked by it. And at the time, the children wouldn't have been here anyway. They were at nursery and school, so it was just obviously a subconscious sort of thought that they were here, but unexplainable.
OK, I'm going to take you down the cellar now. This is where, again, one or two things have happened to us.
Is it a spooky cellar?
It's a very spooky cellar. Now, a lot of things happen in these cellars, Michaela, but let me tell you something that's happened in my spooky experience. I was actually in the bottling area. This is where we keep all the bottles and things. And as I was just moving things around, getting stock, I was aware of someone walk straight past through the door that way. And it was out of the corner of my eye. I put it down to the owner, John, actually walking through. I later found out upstairs that it was actually, he was still up there and no one had been down. I thought maybe it was my imagination, but just a couple of weeks ago, one of our bar staff, Dom, actually had the same thing happen to him, and it scared him stiff too.
Not so long ago, one of the gents were bottling up, and he heard a loud crash and a till had been knocked off, which was just full of pennies. There was no way it could have been knocked off. It had been there for ages. It was just a collection of pennies that we'd saved up over time, and they were all over the floor. And yeah, spirits walking past, or something walking past.
Well, the Lion and Swan certainly has some great ghost stories, but my favourite has to be of the naked lady wearing clogs seen by this fireplace. My only question is, why was she wearing clogs? Hidden in the mist behind me is Pendle Hill here in Lancashire. It's well known for the famous witch trials of 1612. It's not so much a story of ghosts and hauntings, but it's certainly a haunting story.
The Pendle Hill witch trials of 1612 were some of the most infamous in British history. 9 women were accused of meeting up on Pendle Hill and using sorcery and spells to curse and kill 17 men, using cauldrons, teeth, effigies, and even black cats. Fear and hysteria broke out in the local villages, and the women were all arrested, tried, and eventually sent to hang in Lancaster for their crimes. Local historian Simon Entwistle agreed to tell me the chilling story.
So Simon, the Pendle Witches story is an amazing story. How does it all start?
Starts way back in 1612, March 1612, when young Alison Device left her place on the side of Pendle Hill, which is right behind us, and she made her way along the foothills. There she had the misfortune of meeting a gentleman from Halifax called John Law. John Law was a 1612 peddler. He had items which we'd really call 1612 luxuries. Alison begged. "Oh, please, sir, just a few pence, sir." "Be on your way," shouted John Law. All of a sudden, this huge black dog sat next to Alison and came from nowhere, and the dog talked. "Alison, shall I lame him for you?" "Lame him?" All of a sudden, Law fell to the floor and found to his horror he was completely paralysed on his left side. Left arm, left leg, completely useless. He lay on the side of the hill for quite a few hours, and the kind people of Colne, a town in North Pendle, took him down by a stretcher to an old alehouse called the Dog and Partridge. Their word spread back to Halifax, and Abraham, the eldest son, came to collect his father. "Father, what's happened to you? You look terrible. I've been cursed. There's a witch round here, a young girl called Devise. What's more, she's got a dog, and I swear to you, the dog talked."
So Simon, what happened next?
Well, Alison was taken to an alehouse by the eldest son, Abraham. There she confessed to being a witch. She had no idea it was a state capital offence. In doing so, she also incriminated her grandmother. She incriminated Bessie Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern. They were sent to the city of Lancaster and thrown into Lancaster City Castle Jail. 2 days later, on the slopes of Pendle Hill here, at the home of the Device family, Malkin Tower, there the Good Friday meeting of 1612 took place. The whole idea was to get this huge cooking vessel out, light a fire beneath it, and the black syrupy liquid inside the cooking vessel began to bubble and steam. And into that bubbling liquid went crushed, powdered human teeth, the odd clay effigy, and indeed the odd human scalp. The whole idea was to get a potion together to blow the gates of Lancaster City Castle open and rescue their loved ones. I believe 4 of them definitely believed they were witches. I believe they actually had powers. We do know in the courts at Lancaster that when they were cross-examined, they mentioned how they'd made these clay effigies and crumbled them and people were dying. They were found guilty of the murder by witchcraft of 17 local people and indeed having these witches' familiars, which are these 3 large black dogs that came to them at different times of their lives and gave them special powers.
In December 2011, engineers working for a local water company were surprised to unearth the 17th century cottage in the shadow of Pendle Hill, which could have belonged to one of the witches. The cottage contained a sealed room with the bones of a cat bricked into the wall. It's believed that the cat was buried alive to protect the cottage from evil spirits.
Well, every witch has what's called a familiar. This can come in the form of a cat or a dog. In the case of the Pendle witches, they had dogs, but a dog or a cat would give them special powers. Apparently it was the devil in disguise that could change its shape and in return give special powers to these so-called witches.
So how does the story end?
The story ends with 12 people being executed. The 11 Pendle witches and 1 from Windle in St Helens. They were all found guilty of making clay effigies and crumbling them. And people were dying of mysterious ailments. 17 local people in all. They were then taken to the pillory at Lancaster where they had to mount a rostrum. A rope was placed around their necks and the stools kicked out from underneath them. These poor people didn't actually hang, they strangled to death. It was a very, very cruel and barbaric act.
Do you think they were witches?
I believe 4 of them believed they were indeed witches, but I believe some may have been completely innocent of the crimes against them.
The idea that the witches were innocent is growing in popularity. Local businessman Julian Jordan is hoping to petition Parliament to overturn their convictions.
Julian, how well known is the Pendle witch story to local people around here?
It's extremely well known. It's a tale we're all told when we're kids. I know in my case, I was told by my grandparents and my parents. I've told my kids, and obviously this year especially, with it being the 400th anniversary of the witch trials, it's something you just can't escape locally. But that said, you know, ever since I was a kid growing up in this area, it's something that you saw almost every day because lots of businesses around here use witch emblems. The buses use witch emblems. Even today, the main line bus to Manchester is called the Witch Way. And as I say, there are lots of local brands which you use witch imagery in the way they promote themselves.
So it's really legendary.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the sort of central planks of that legend is the sort of name of Alice Nutter and her family, you know.
And Alice Nutter was one of the accused witches?
She was one of the ones which that was tried and hanged in Lancaster. And this is actually the Nutter family plot.
So is this where she was buried?
Well, it's an interesting question. There's conjecture as to whether or not she's buried here or not. I think probably not, because as a convicted witch, she wouldn't have been buried in consecrated ground. But this is certainly the Nutter family plot. There's a bit of a local legend about them paying to bring her remains back here and bury her in this plot. And as you can see in the tombstone, there is a skull and crossbones emblem there.
Why would it have had the skull and crossbone on it then?
Well, again, that's an interesting theory. Some people think that actually denotes the fact that this is a witch's grave, and it's certainly known locally as the witch's grave. But I'm also led to believe that back in the 1600s, it was just a fairly common symbol that was used, and it just denoted death.
Do local people think that they were, in fact, witches?
It depends entirely who you speak to. A lot of people believe they were witches, but a lot of people think whether or not they were witches, they were innocent. Certainly one of the things that me and some of the people that I'm involved with would like to do is call for the convictions to be quashed. I think they lived in an age of superstition, so whether or not they were witches, whether or not they believed they were witches, I think we can look back at it from a relatively rational position in this day and age and say they almost certainly weren't witches, and certainly that there was a grave miscarriage of justice there.
So, were they really witches? Were they tortured into their confession? I guess we'll never know. But I'm sure those 10 women that were hanged in 1612 had no idea that we'd still be telling their story 400 years later. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Powerful, deadly and completely unpredictable. 10 things you didn't know about earthquakes, a Channel premiere tonight at 10 after more Great British Ghosts. New to yesterday, next.